Well, for several years, you've seen news reports about these protesters from the Westboro Baptist Church protesting at military funerals, holding up anti-gay signs such as "God hates fags" and other signs such as "Thank God for dead soldiers." It was a Supreme Court case yesterday, and now we are joined by lawyers from both sides of the Snyder versus Phelps, Snyder versus Westboro Baptist Church case. From Kansas City, Missouri, Margie Phelps, the lead lawyer for the Westboro Baptist Church and for her father, Fred Phelps. And from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, Timothy Nieman, who filed an amicus brief on behalf of the Veterans for Foreign Wars on behalf of the Snyder family. Mrs. Phelps, if you would briefly state for our audience the argument that you made to the Supreme Court yesterday on behalf of the Westboro Baptist Church.
Sure. The 7 Westboro Baptist Church picketers were over 1,000 feet from the church. Between them and the funeral goers were over 100 other people engaged in expressive activity. No one going into the funeral saw or heard the Westboro picketers. And when it was time for the funeral to start, they left. So by any definition or rationale, there was no invasion of privacy. As to the disagreement with viewpoint, because that's what the case is really about. They don't like the viewpoint, they don't like the core message that your soldiers are dying for your sins. Well, the court's been clear for too many years that using subjective terms like outrage and offense and only claiming an adverse emotional impact from words is not a sufficient interest to override the First Amendment right to engage in robust public debate. All the nation is talking about these dying soldiers. The majority view, like 310 million of you to 60 of us. The majority view is he's a hero and God is blessing America. Our dissenting view is that he put on the uniform of a nation that is fast chasing same-sex marriage and has made proud sin of every kind its policies.
All right, Mrs. Phelps, back
and God is not blessing America. So the dissenting view is protected by the First Amendment. You don't need a First Amendment for the popular view.
Now, Mrs. Phelps, one of the arguments that you stated earlier was there was no invasion of privacy. Do you think that the case would be different if perhaps you had been seen during the funeral, if the Snyder family had seen you protesting? Would there be a different case?
Not if we had been seen. Not if we had been seen. Taking the line of cases about abortion picketers, the court's been clear. Merely seeing words you don't like does not create liability.
All right.
Avert your eyes. But if, for example, we had walked into the church with our picket signs, then liability may be appropriate. And of course, everyone knows that's not how we do business.
All right, Mrs. Phelps, thank you. Timothy Nieman, briefly, if you would, state the argument made by the Snyder side of this case.
Thank you, Peter. And this case really isn't about just being able to avert your eyes. I think that the argument that was made yesterday by Mr. Summers on behalf of Mr. Snyder was, the question was best summed up by Justice Ginsburg, who asked, this is really a case about exploiting a private family's grief. And the question is, why should the First Amendment tolerate exploiting this Marine's family at this vulnerable time when they wanted to have a private funeral ceremony for their son? The Snyder family did not ask for the Westboro Church to come to the funeral. Mr. Snyder was not a public figure, despite what the Westboro Church might say about that. He was merely trying to put his son to rest and had the unfortunate situation where the only time that he would have the opportunity to do that, you cannot redo a funeral ceremony, you cannot redo a burial. That sacred time of mourning was turned into a circus by the presence of the Westboro Baptist Church folks being there. This isn't a case about the content of the message. It is really a case, again, as Justice Ginsburg, I thought so eloquently put it yesterday, about exploiting a private family's grief. And in this case, it happens to be a private family of a fallen American soldier, and that's why the VFW in particular got involved with this case.
Mrs. Phelps?
Yes, you want me to answer that?
Yes, ma'am.
Of course, exploiting someone's grief doesn't hook into any legal principle. All it is emotive, undisciplined language. Mr. Snyder, I will use that language, Mr. Snyder exploited his own grief when within 2 days of his son's death, he began holding forth in multiple media interviews, complaining about the war, complaining about the dying soldiers, asking in the public airwaves how many more parents were going to have to suffer like he and his ex-wife were suffering over this senseless war. You don't get to start a public discussion in that fashion without letting other people answer. And if you don't want that discussion to take place on the occasion of your son's death or funeral, don't start the discussion on that occasion. They've turned these funerals of these soldiers into patriotic pep rallies, more expressive activity going on outside, and long after we were gone on the whole 15-mile route to the cemetery. We don't go to cemeteries. We don't follow the procession. Others do and engage in expressive activity. You can't open up a public dialogue and then tell one viewpoint to shut up. If you think that's exploitive, stop doing it. When soldiers' funerals are private, we don't go. But when you invite the media, when you invite the Patriot Guard riders, when you invite all the public, including putting your obituary in the Baltimore Sun, that big newspaper, when you've got no connection to Baltimore, you don't live in Baltimore. They did all that on purpose to have a big, giant, splashy public display because they want this nation to come and bow down to those dead soldiers.
All right.
Now, you made all those
Timothy
decisions.
Nieman, final word before we go to calls.
You know, putting an obituary in a newspaper, if that's the standard for becoming a public figure, every single American citizen who has a family member that dies, whether they're a military member or just a common everyday guy, opens themselves to this sort of protest. It was put in the Baltimore Sun because the funeral was held in a town that was in with reasonable proximity to Baltimore. It's not as if the obituary is put in newspapers all across the United States. And this is another point that I thought the justices did an excellent job with yesterday. You can turn any single item into a matter of public concern. For example, I know on your show you have a Republican line, a Democratic line, and an independent line for people to call in to voice their opinions. I mean, if a Democrat dies and they put an obituary in the newspaper, you could open that up to all kinds of disruptive protests just because they happen to be a registered Democrat or a registered Republican or whatever it may be. I mean, there's no end to where this could go if we allow the Phelps's position to go forward in this situation.
Timothy Nieman is in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. He's an attorney for the VFW, which filed an amicus brief on behalf of the Snyder family. Margie Phelps is in Kansas City, Missouri, attorney for Fred Phelps Sr. and for the Westboro Baptist Church. She is a graduate of Washburn University School of Law. First call for our two guests, Oakford, Pennsylvania. Barb, Independent Line.
Hi.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. I think this is just so wrong what this woman and that Baptist group is trying to do. I mean, a funeral is a private event. I don't understand how the law can see it any other way. There must be a way to make the case that this is a private event. And
Mr. Nieman, is there another way to make this a case that this is a private event?
Well, I do, and that's one of the primary approaches that we took in our brief. The Supreme Court has carved out an exception to free speech issues, which is called the captive audience doctrine. And basically what that says is that if you are in a place where you are a captive audience, for example, if you're in your home, the court has applied it also in hospital settings, but if you're in a situation where you really can't leave, For example, the house is described in these cases as the last form of refuge. The court has says you can put restrictions on that. You can bar picketers in front of people's houses. You can limit picketing in front of hospitals. And the VFW believes, and other people that have filed briefs in this case and argue it, that the captive attendees at a funeral, if you attend a funeral, you're in a captive audience. You only have one opportunity to lay your loved one, your friend, husband, wife, son, whatever it may be, daughter, to rest. And you have to be there. You have to be at that church. You have to be at that location in order to do that. You don't get to do it twice. And I believe that the captive audience doctrine is a way to accomplish that, for the court to reach the right decision in a constitutional way that has already been articulated by the court in similar cases in the past.
Margie Phelps, the captive audience argument.
Of course, we're very familiar with that doctrine, and we discussed it at length yesterday, and the court has been explicit. In order for the captive audience doctrine to apply, the picketer has got to be right out front, up in your grill, confronting you physically, making it impractical for you to get from your car to inside without running a gauntlet of picketers. 1,000 feet away, out of sight, out of sound. What an irresponsible misrepresentation to suggest that the captive audience doctrine would apply to that situation. They didn't even see the 7 picketers, so how could they have been captive to them? That funeral went off without a hitch. Every detail that was planned for that funeral happened without disruption. The priest who did it, who did the ceremony, testified he didn't even know there were picketers there. No one mentioned them. Their cars and went picketers long gone.
Margie Phelps, was this the first time you've argued in front of the Supreme Court, and what was your experience like?
It is the first time, and my experience was that it was absolutely marvelous. Of course, I feel quite privileged representing this little church in the highest court in the world, but I also find that the justices are familiar with their cases and professional, and gave the church a fair opportunity to be heard on their conscientious, faithful ministry.
Mr. Nieman, what was your experience like in the court?
Well, it was a great experience for me as well. I did not have the pleasure of arguing the case yesterday, and I would just like to say to Ms. Phelps, I thought she did a very nice job. I may not agree with her position, but I thought she did a good job before the court. It was a great experience, and I agree the justices seemed extremely interested in the case. They seemed extremely knowledgeable, and they really honed in on the issues that are at task here. And I think they probably could have continued the argument much longer than they did if there had been time for it.
John in Leesburg, Virginia, Republican line. You're on with Margie Phelps and Timothy Nieman. Go ahead.
Yes, good morning. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. I'm a veteran of the U.S. Navy, and I just wanted to point out that in this case and all these cases that the church would go to somebody's funeral that gave their life for this country, they gave up everything. They gave up all their rights. That individual gave up everything that they can give. And I do not think the right of freedom of speech should be used to make the point they're trying to make. They just want the public forum and the attention to put their message out.
John, now you say you don't think they should be able to use or should use it, but do you think they should have the right to use it?
I don't think so. I think...
And where do you draw the line? On the free speech issues.
Military people that gave their lives to this country.
Well, Margie Phelps, 48 states have passed laws, essentially laws against what the Westboro Baptist Church does. George W. Bush in 2006 signed the National Cemeteries Act, essentially in response to what your group has been doing. Are those, in your view, constitutional laws?
Well, and incidentally, I picketed President Bush within 10 minutes of him signing that law, just by the way. But I've read all those laws, and 80% of them are grossly unconstitutional. But almost none of them put us as far away as we put ourselves. So we can comfortably continue to function, and therefore we let the law stand. We've challenged a few of them when they've been just simply misapplied. But look at this inconsistency. So you got these soldiers allegedly going over to Afghanistan and Iraq, which is a war that has nothing to do with our constitutional democracy. But even if you assume for the sake of argument that they're dying for the right to speak, and then you get one of these military folks, and we get this on the streets all the time, saying, I died for your right to speak, only don't say words I don't like. How un-American could that possibly be? You know what? If they died for our right to speak, shut the hell up and let us speak.
Next call, Rockville, Maryland. Stone on our Democrats line. You're on the air.
Thank you, Peter, and good morning, Attorney Phelps, and good morning, Attorney Nieman. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Please allow me to ask a very brief question and a very brief comment. Attorney Phelps, I think you're an extremely brilliant person. I'm a middle-aged black man. I'm not a homosexual, I'm not a pedophile, nor am I a philanderer. However, I saw you on television on numerous occasions, but especially yesterday, I was stricken by how much courage you have, despite the controversy of what you're doing. However, when you broke into song, saying that you are going to hell, I have to admit, many of us are going to hell. I may be one of those persons. However, I do believe that the court will uphold your right, regardless of how terrible it is. And I wanted to ask you, would you consider extending your campaign of protest to come to some of the black inner cities in America to protest the fanatical, hellish violence of black-on-black crime, especially in Washington, D.C. about a week or two ago, at a funeral, a group of thugs came and
Stone,
overwhelmed the protesters and shot and killed one of the funeral members.
All right, Margie Phelps, what's your response to that caller?
Yeah, I read about that case, and it's a symptom. And so we don't, as a rule, focus our publishings on the symptoms in that measure. It's a symptom of the proud policies of sin in this nation that the young people are dropping like flies. And so, no, I don't think it'd be likely that we'd show up at a funeral. We're trying to go to tell people the military in this nation are putting on uniforms that represent same-sex marriage. Connect the dot. One of God's favorite weapons of his armory is to get your young men and women on the battlefield and kill them. And if this nation wasn't Bible illiterate, they would know that. We need to take that message. Justice Ginsburg asked, why go there? Because the court has recognized the symbology of context. Where the major trauma is where God's got your attention. The message has got to be delivered there. I'm very sorry about that incident at that funeral. It should not have happened. But these symptoms, it's too late.
Mr. Nieman?
Yes. I would just like to follow up a little bit on what Justice Ginsburg did say yesterday. When she asked this question about exploiting the Marine's funeral and a private family's funeral, she said that, she asked the question in the context there are so many other places where you can express these opinions. This case isn't about the content of their speech, despite what Ms. Phelps says. At the heart of this case is really what right does this church and these protesters have to interfere and interrupt and take away from a private mourning family the right to bury their son or daughter, whether that son or daughter was killed in military action, whether they died of some other issue. But it's not the content. As Justice Ginsburg said, they can go say this somewhere else, but can they say it in this particular place?
Timothy Nieman is a graduate of the University of Virginia, where he got his J.D. Chicago, Michael, Independent. Hi.
Hello?
Hi, you're on the air, Michael.
Yes. I noticed that these protesters got signs saying something about fag and breast cancer. I mean, what they got to do with the soldiers? Two, I never see any of these protesters just like this woman who protest against these soldiers coming. I like to see them coming to the west side or south side of Chicago and do the same thing. And see what happens.
All right.
Picket.
Margie Phelps, what's your response to
Yes.
that? I think that caller was saying if go into a different type of neighborhood,
Yes.
go to a gay pride parade and protest there.
Right,
Do you do
right.
that, or is it just military
We've
funerals?
protested more gay pride parades. We've done them in Washington, D.C., and New York City. We've done numerous gay pride parades, and we've picketed numerous times in the south side of Chicago. We've hit your streets for 20 years. We've crisscrossed this nation. We've done over 44,000 pickets. Less than 1% of them have been the soldiers' funerals. So, and look, don't pretend this isn't about viewpoint. We spent 20 minutes yesterday in that argument debating what the word "you" means in the God hates you sign. Remember, while 7 little Westboro picketers stood in the South 40, 1,000 feet away, disrupting nothing, interfering with nothing, over 100 other people stood right outside the front doors of the church with a different message, and everybody applauded them. Don't pretend this is not about viewpoint. This nation does not want to hear about its sins, but the servants of God are duty-bound to tell you about your sins, and we're going to do it.
Margie Phelps, the word "you," very briefly explain the legal arguments for and against using that word, or what you heard from the justices.
The essential question is, when we say God hates you and you're going to hell, foolishly it has been suggested that applied to the dead kid. The dead kid's gone wherever he's gone. He wasn't there to see the signs. All of the Westboro picketers testified that they'd had those signs in play for years, and it applies to anyone and everyone who will listen, which is what prompted Justice Ginsburg to say, well, they used those same signs at Annapolis and at the Maryland State House earlier in the day. I think it just means, and she's right, the whole society's rotten. Amen.
Mr. Nieman, what about the argument that the justices made, or the questions the justices asked about the word "you"?
Well, I think, you in the context of outside of a funeral where the person being buried is the Marine, and when you have signs that say things like "Semper Fi Fags," is a Marine, I mean, that could only apply to one person in that case. Ms. Phelps said earlier that context is so important in these cases. Well, in this case, there's really only one context, and there's only one idea that there can be, and that these signs were directed at the Snyder family, at Matthew Snyder himself, and they passed out brochures and literature before the funeral to let everyone know they would be there to protest at the St. John's, I think it was called Catholic Dog Kennel, which again is just more speech directed toward the individuals that were going to be involved with this protest. If they had said these things at some distance away, perhaps if they had done the protest in Baltimore or somewhere else, it might be a different issue. But they were specifically targeting this funeral. They were specifically targeting this family. There's no other conclusion that can be drawn. And even the appellate court, which overturned the decision below on that specific issue, came to that conclusion that it was directed toward the Snyder family.
Mrs. Phelps?
Our message is for the living. It included Mr. and Mrs. Snyder, but it included the rest of the nation. There is nothing wrong under the law with taking a message to a target audience. The requirement is that you do it within proper bounds. And he just said, perhaps if we had done it in Baltimore. Half of the case was about an epic written, posted on a passive church website, that was written in Topeka, Kansas, halfway across the country. What the trial court said is no time, no place, no manner can you say something that the family of the dead soldier takes offense at. That's too broad. Look where that would leave every publisher in the land. Someone called in a little earlier saying they saw our "Thank God for Breast Cancer" sign. And his wife, he says, died of breast cancer a year and a half ago. Does he get a cause of action? Because we say one of the ways God in his righteous judgments, one of his righteous earth judgments, is that he's afflicted this nation with huge rates of breast cancer. That's good Bible doctrine. Does that man get a cause of action? It's ridiculous. Where would it end?
Christopher in Brooklyn, New York, Republican line. You're on with Margie Phelps and Timothy Nieman. Please go ahead.
Hi, thank you for C-SPAN, and thank you for taking my call. Ms. Phelps, I really don't think that you are a very good attorney. One of your earlier comments was that the Supreme Court is the highest court in the world. It is not the highest court in the world. Its jurisdiction is only for the United States. It's not the highest court in the world, despite your happiness there. And moreover, your comments concerning the father becoming a public figure would be fine if you were protesting the father's funeral. This Marine was his funeral. He is not a public figure. The people who attended the funeral are not public figures. It was not their funeral.
Mrs. Phelps?
As to the court, do you deny that you're the superpower? Do you really deny that you're the most powerful court in the world if you're the highest court of the superpower? Whether I'm a good lawyer or not, I don't know, and I don't care. My wisdom comes from God. I don't give myself any credit. And as to whether the father is a private figure, he's the plaintiff, sir. The question always in a speech case is whether the plaintiff is a private figure, limited purpose public figure, or full public figure.
Timothy Nieman, we have this email from Leon, a Korean War veteran in Oklahoma City. This funeral protest definitely was a hate protest that is against our existing federal laws. Many of our callers in our earlier segment, Mr. Nieman, talked about hate crimes and hate speech. Did you use that argument in your argument yesterday?
Well, just so we're clear, I did not make the argument yesterday.
On
but
your
in our
side,
brief,
yes, yeah.
On our side, yes. In our brief, we did talk obviously about how this speech was hateful, and it was insulting, and it was just went beyond bounds of decency in this situation. But this was not a case about the state enforcing hate crime laws or anything along those lines. This was a lawsuit brought by the family of Matthew Snyder for infliction of emotional distress, intentional infliction of emotional distress. So basically what he was looking for was a remedy, a civil remedy, because of the suffering that he went through as a result of what was done and what was taken away from him by these defendants, the Westboro Baptist Church, in connection with his son's funeral. So while there may be an element of hate speech to this, it wasn't really an issue in this case, though the justices did spend a good bit of time yesterday talking about fighting words, which is another doctrine, constitutional doctrine, where speech can be limited, where speech is so incendiary that it could lead to violence or to fighting.
Brooklyn, New York. John, Democrat this time. Go ahead.
Good morning. I have 3 questions, please. First, when is the Supreme Court going to come to a decision in this case? Second, if the Muslims are able to build a mosque at Ground Zero, which is an internal cemetery, and for many 9/11 families, that's also emotionally distressing, then why can't they protest at funerals? And third, does Ms. Phelps have any concerns that 3 other justices are Jewish and they may have some kind of bias? Thank you.
Mrs. Phelps?
3 of them are Jewish and 6 of them are Catholic. Some of our signs say Jews killed Jesus, priests raped children, and Pope in hell. Those are the facts. I believe we have a reasonable basis for expecting that when you sit in the highest court in the world, that you set aside your personal viewpoints and you fulfill your oath and you follow the law. So no, I don't have any concerns about that.
Port Orange, Florida. Steve, Independent Line.
Yes, good morning. I would like to express my agreement with Mrs. Phelps. I think the issue here is strictly freedom of speech. The Constitution must be supreme. There should not be any exemptions to free speech on the basis of emotional trauma. I also like to make the point that a lot of these military people are sacrificing their lives for their country. I think they're going in, they're taking a risk for the benefits. In a bad economy, they have very little choice.
All right, thank you for that comment. This email from Frank Lusk, retired U.S. Army, 30 years, from Gordonville, Texas. The founders of the USA, when they wrote the First Amendment, did not mean all speech was allowed. Read history. The First Amendment came out so people would be able to talk against the government. Under the King of England, they could be punished. Mrs. Phelps, what about that argument?
Well, the way the First Amendment came about is a man named John Leland in Virginia found himself in his mid-30s having fled religious persecution, having fled a situation where him being the dissenting religious viewpoint, he was imperiled by speaking according to his conscience. And by the providence of God, he was able to deliver to Madison the votes needed out of Virginia to get that Constitution passed. And there is a garden in Orange, Virginia, with a little memorial that memorializes this event right here. John Madison and John Leland sat down, and Mr. Leland, who was probably one of God's elect, said, I'm not going to deliver those votes unless you get us a Bill of Rights that starts with the First Amendment so that people can speak according to their conscience, even if the rest of the world disagrees with them. That is what the First Amendment is about. In the closing argument at trial, the attorney for this faithless father stood there and said to that jury, it's 300 million of us against 70 of them. Well, it's really 310 million. And that's true. And that is when the First Amendment had better kick in. De Tocqueville said that the fly in the ointment, the worm in the apple of this democracy that you're putting in play is that people will think mob rule is in charge. That is what our Constitution prohibits. You swear allegiance to that flag every day. The republic for which it stands says mob rule doesn't get to silence the dissenting voice. You either mean that or you don't, and this case is the case that's going to find out.
Mrs. Phelps, several members of your church, is this fair to say that several members or some members of your church have left, including members of your family, because of the tactics of the Westboro Baptist Church?
You were right up to the tactics part. No, they left because they don't want to serve God. They don't believe these things that we believe. They want to join the world and living the way of the world. Everyone's right. You come to years, you got to make a decision. Will you serve God or will you not? Their decision was they would not.
Mr. Nieman, several
Yes,
callers earlier, and you can comment on anything that Margie Phelps has said, but several callers throughout this morning and a couple of tweeters have said that trying to parse out the First Amendment in this case would turn the First Amendment into a pretzel if we started trying to write out exceptions, et cetera, et cetera. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, and let me answer that in a second. I just am a little disappointed that Ms. Phelps continues to run down Mr. Snyder by referring to him as a faithless father in what I was hoping was going to be a fairly civil debate here this morning. But beyond that, you know, the Supreme Court has never said that there's an absolute right to free speech, and the types of line drawings, or maybe as your listeners have said, of making it into a pretzel has been commonplace. You know, we all know that you can't yell fire in a crowded theater just to see what happens. You know, that's illegal. There's things like pornography are illegal. There's sexually harassing speech is illegal. There's all types of speech that have been limited in this country, and there's been restrictions put on when and how those even public speech on public issues can be stated. So the court has consistently drawn lines. It's an evolving, and it's not an easy area, but the court has done it all the time. The lower courts consistently do it in cases of defamation to try to figure out whether someone is a private figure or a public figure, whether the speech is opinion or fact, and whether the speech is true or false. So there's all sorts of lines, there's all sorts of analysis and balancing that goes into this situation, and I think the court is fully able to do that here. And even to go back to one other caller who had talked about the composition of the court, and Ms. Phelps point out that I think it's 3 Jewish and 6 Catholic. Based upon the arguments yesterday, and based upon the professionalism of every one of those justices, those facts will have absolutely no bearing whatsoever on which way the court comes out in this case.
East Point, Michigan, Santo, Democrat.
Well, I think this is just another perfect example of how organized religion and some folks interpret the Bible. It's people like the Phelps Church that continue to spread their hate and continue to keep the country from going forward. These are just 80 people. Who cares about them? I consider them backwoods. They probably sleep with their children anyways, Miss Phelps, hillbillies. We know what you guys are about. I think the FBI should investigate you guys.
So Santo, do they have a right when it comes? Santo, hello, Santo. Okay, you know what? I'm going to put you on hold. We're going to try to stick to the legal arguments here that were made in the Supreme Court. So, Santo, do you think that they have a right? Do you think that the Westboro Baptist Church and the Phelps family have a right to do what they do at military funerals? We'll never know. Next call goes to Randy in River Falls, Wisconsin. Hi, Republican.
Good morning. I have a question
Morning.
or comment for Mrs. Phelps. You do have a right to the First Amendment. Take your protest, get a permit, take your protest to the government that wrote the Constitution back in the day. And what you're doing is you are invasion. That's an invasion of a private party. Do it to every time there's a funeral. Go to the Capitol, have your protest, make your statement, and have a little common sense there, please. Thank you.
Margie Phelps.
Well, of course, if that gentleman believes that's the proper way for him to make publications from his heart and his conscience, that's how he ought to do it. Meanwhile, the Constitution gives every citizen of this nation the right to take their message to the nation in any lawful, peaceful manner. And what the case says, it's a 1919 case, and it's called Schenck, S-C-H-E-N-K. What it says is you can't falsely cry fire in a theater with the only purpose of causing a stampede. If you are standing there watching the theater on fire and see people about to die in that fire, what kind of a cruel monster are you to stand by selfishly silent? This nation is on fire.
Mr. Nieman.
Yes, and I use the theater case as an example of how the court has drawn lines, and that's true. I mean, you know, if the theater's on fire, then you should yell fire. But the bottom line point here is that the court consistently has drawn lines in terms of what is right and what is wrong with respect to speech. You can't just say anything anywhere. And the way that the Phelps are trying to expand the doctrine of free speech really opens up every single private individual's funeral, their home, their business, whatever it may be, to public picketing, to protest, because every single person, no matter who you are, has some sort of a view on an issue or some sort of a view on things. And the way that they look at, the Phelpses look at the world, every single one of us is a sinner, and that's why we have public problems and public policy issues are made in this nation that are problematic. It really opens every single American citizen up to this sort of unfortunate and what I feel is illegal type of protest.
Kai Bell tweets in, please ask Margie Phelps, if the court decides against you, will you stop demonstrations at soldiers' funerals?
No, no, and no. We'll finish our testimony to this nation, and while I enjoy hypothetical questions, we spent some time laboring in that vineyard yesterday. The court is going to rule 9-0 that this is protected speech. This is a nation of law, a nation not of mob rule. This church follows the law of the land. We follow God's law and we follow man's law. We're not trying to carve out anything. We're trying to keep you all from carving out an exception called, you hurt my feelings, my conscience is bothering me, make them shut up.
Margie Phelps, if you wouldn't stop, let's say again we're conjecturing, but if the court does rule against you and you wouldn't stop, why bother going through this exercise with the court if it doesn't matter what their opinion is?
Well, they sued us, and we use whatever form we have to use to sustain this ministry. We answered their charges.
What kind of law do you practice in Topeka?
Well, I actually only do law part-time. I do another professional endeavor full-time, but my practice is predominantly First Amendment.
And Mr. Nieman, what kind of law do you practice?
I primarily practice commercial law, commercial litigation, and I also do appellate work here in Pennsylvania.
Blacksburg, Virginia. Debbie, Democrat. Hi, you're on with Timothy Nieman and Margie Phelps.
Hi, Ms. Phelps. You know, you all came here to Blacksburg this year, very close to the anniversary of April 16th, the massacre at Virginia Tech, and I certainly was out there with my own sign, but I don't understand. Did God tell you to come to Virginia Tech, the site of this horrific mass murder? Why were you here?
Mrs. Phelps?
Yes, I'll tell you again, as I said earlier. The wrath of God is pouring out on this nation. It is the duty of the Church of the Lord Jesus Christ to articulate to this nation, you brought that wrath by your sin. We've got to do that in ways that you hear. So we do parodies in song and video, we do signs, we do multiple web pages. We are going to use every lawful means where your eyes, ears, and hearts are drawn by the Lord your God to get these words in front of you. That is 100% lawful. It is the essence of the constitutional democracy we say we have. And ma'am, you did the right thing. You got a placard and put some words on it. You answer speech with speech in this nation.
Mrs. Phelps, what is the best website if people want to know, go to your website? What's the best way for them to do that?
www.godhatesfags.com.
Mr. Nieman, you wanted to say something?
Well, I was just going to say, Ms. Phelps talked about how the Westboro Church acts lawfully and they protest lawfully and they follow the laws of the United States, yet we've just heard her say that if the Supreme Court rules against the church, they will continue to protest in the way they've been protesting. This is really a case, I think, as Justice Ginsburg said, of exploitation. Not only exploitation of this family, but exploitation of a lot of people that have suffered grief or tragedy in this country, and it's really a shame. And I hope the Supreme Court brings an end to it.
A few more minutes left with our guests, Margie Phelps and Timothy Nieman. Evanston, Illinois. Randy is a Democrat. Please go ahead, Randy.
Yes, good morning. You know, I want to say that I really respect Ms. Phelps, and I have the utmost respect for you now that I've heard you describe you guys' location. You're 1,000 feet away. The media has portrayed you as actually standing outside the pearly gate shouting at the family, and in fact, it is untrue. And if the court comes back and rules against you, that would be a huge chunk snatched out of the freedom of speech. Same way they did with when they came in favor of the Citizen United and allow corporations to just do what they do now. They give this money to all this. So I encourage you that you stay the course. Do not give up this fight. You remain in this fight to keep the freedom of speech. Thank you.
Mrs. Phelps, who filed amicus briefs on behalf of the Westboro Baptist Church?
Well, it was a group of First Amendment scholars, a group of 20-some media organizations, the Thomas Jefferson Center, the ACLU, the Liberty Council, the Rutherford Institute. I may be leaving some out. Those are the ones I remember.
Did most of them in their amicus briefs use, when referring to your tactics or to what you do, refer to them as reprehensible, repugnant, offensive?
Every kind of colorful word you could imagine, which, by the way, is why, even though people raised question about it, I did the work before the court because I appreciate that's their viewpoint, but this little church is not going to apologize for its words, and I was concerned that of the many folks who approached us offering to take the lead on the case, that they would not be able to resist the temptation to give in to the enormous pressure for political correctness in this nation, they would not have resisted the temptation to have apologized for our words. And let me clarify something. Whatever the court rules, it may give some more guidelines. When a state or Congress passes a law that puts some restrictions on when, where, and how we can speak, we either challenge them or we follow them. If the court gives us some guidelines, we'll follow them. You are not shutting up this church.
Mr. Nieman, besides the VFW, who else filed amicus briefs on behalf of the Snyder family?
There were 40 senators. It was one time when Mitch McConnell and Senator Harry Reid were able to get together on something, but 40 senators filed an amicus brief. There were states attorney general that 48 of the states attorney generals filed an amicus in favor of Mr. Snyder. The Veterans of Foreign War, the American Legion. There also were a couple of law school professors that filed briefs as well. It was about the same number of amicus briefs on both sides.
Yardley, Pennsylvania. Christine, Republican line. Hi.
Hello.
Please go ahead, Christine.
Okay. I'm Christine. I'm a Christian. I have a question. Did Jesus die for perfect Pharisee lawyers such as yourself, or did he die for the sinners? And I also want to say that you're in violation of the law that says that you should love your neighbor as yourself.
Margie Phelps.
Well, there's a seminal verse. I hope you understand seminal. It means the first time it comes up, where you read of the royal law. It's one of the two commandments on which the Lord Jesus Christ said all other commandments hang. And it is love thy neighbor as thyself. You don't get to make up what that means, just like you don't get to make up what terms out of the cases mean. The seminal verse says that you do it by three ways. You obey the commandments of God yourself, so don't covet your neighbor's property and don't sleep with your neighbor's wife. The second way is you urge your neighbor himself to obey the commandments of God, lest he bring the wrath of God down on his head. And third, when he doesn't, you rebuke him. So that passage says, if you don't rebuke your neighbor for his sin, you hate him in your heart. I don't know anybody in the world outside of Westboro Baptist Church fulfilling that royal law. And the other question, who did Christ die for? Well, you know what? If you crack a Bible and just read the words that are read, those are Christ's words, you would have your answer. He died for the mournful, penitent, obedient sinner, not the proud homosexual walking in the gay pride parade. That lie told by the 2 million false prophets of this land is why we're in this mess.
Why is it the gay issue, Margie Phelps, that gets your blood boiling?
Doesn't get my blood boiling, it gets me talking. And the reason it gets me talking is it's because what you all are talking about. We did not make that the front burner boiler issue of this nation. It's not me who puts in every headline, in every publication forum in this nation, a burning quest for same-sex marriage. Once you bring it up, however, we will comment on God's view, just like once Mr. Snyder brought it up, we answered him. And earlier, when Mr. Nieman said, well, everybody could be their target. Yes, you enter the public discussion, and we will answer you. You don't enter the public discussion, we won't even know about you.
Sue Brokaw of Whiting, New Jersey, emails in protesting at any funeral service is inappropriate and insensitive. However, the rights that protect the Phelps free speech would also protect Americans who wanted to protest at one of their church services. Commerce Township, Michigan. Donovan, Democrat, you're on the air.
Hi. I'd just like to say that these protesters are not actually whistleblowers. They're actually assuming the role of characters in the Bible, characters such as Job, that can't know the will of God, and they're not actually making claims about or expressing their First Amendment right. They're just trying to know the will of God, which they can't do.
Gary in Lancaster, Massachusetts, Democrat. We're talking about the Supreme Court case protesting at military funerals heard yesterday in the Supreme Court. Only a couple minutes left. Margie Phelps and Timothy Nieman are our guests. Go ahead, Gary.
Yes, I just wanted to ask Ms. Phelps there, if she seems to know so much about the Bible, if the Bible is central to her, the mission of going on protesting at funerals and places like that. I became familiar with the Bible when I was in the Navy, and there's many passages in the Bible that talks about God loving the world, okay? And if she's familiar with the Bible, so she ought to know what John 3:16, that verse, what that says. And that is principal to the Christian belief. That is a central verse, scripture verse, for those who believe in the Christian religion. Does she know what that verse says?
Mrs. Phelps?
Also central to the Christian belief is John 3:18. You need to keep reading, sir. He died for the believers. He did not die for the unbelievers. It should be the burning question on the hearts and minds of all 310 million Americans. How do you get into the category of believer or unbeliever? And, by the way, now that we keep bringing the Bible up, it is the revealed will of God. What nonsense to say you cannot determine the will of God. Can you read?
Mr. Nieman, this email from Robert in Gray Court, South Carolina, this is a situation where free speech and freedom of religion collide. A funeral is a religious activity and protected by the Constitution. Was that an argument used by your side yesterday?
No, that did not come up in the argument yesterday. But, just to respond to something that Ms. Phelps said, it's okay for her to rebuke her neighbor, but the question in this case, and I'm not an expert on biblical interpretation, but the question is whether she can rebuke her neighbor at a private funeral or whether she can use some other form to do that. And that's really the heart of this case. Where and how can they say the things that they want to say?
Last call for our two guests, East Greenbush, New York. Addie on our independent line, you got the last word. Go ahead.
Good morning. This is an extremely troubling situation. Firstly, Mr. Nieman, our society is beginning to recognize the destructiveness of vilifying language, and there are many hate crime statutes throughout the country. Why was this not used as a basis for the case? Was that not possible where it was originally brought?
The reason being is this was a private lawsuit by Mr. Snyder against the church as opposed to the state of Maryland trying to enforce the hate crime statute. So it really wasn't part of the case per se. I mean, there obviously hate speech and fighting words and things like that were brought up and were discussed. But in terms of the actual enforcement of a state statute by the state, that was not what occurred in this case.
And we are out of time. Timothy Nieman, amicus brief for the Snyder family on behalf of the VFW. Margie Phelps, lawyer for the Westboro Baptist Church, and her father, Fred Phelps. Thank you both for being on the Washington Journal to discuss this case.
Thank you.
About an hour and 15 minutes left in our program this morning. Coming up next is Ilse Hoag from MoveOn.org. We'll talk about progressives and election 2010. After that, Ryan Crocker will join us. It's the 9th anniversary of the start of the Afghanistan war. But first, this news update from C-SPAN Radio.
It's 8:42 a.m. Eastern Time. 2 former presidents and a former governor are making appearances on the same day in the state of Alabama. George W. Bush will speak Thursday evening at the University of Mobile's annual leadership banquet. On the same day, Jimmy Carter and his wife Rosalind are being honored by Habitat for Humanity in Birmingham. And Sarah Palin visits Montgomery to speak at a fundraiser for Faulkner University. And that former governor and former vice presidential candidate is also planning a trip to Delaware to campaign for Republican Senate candidate Christine O'Donnell. She tells Fox News that she's excited about it. A Fairleigh Dickinson University survey shows Christine O'Donnell trailing her Democratic opponent Chris Coons by 17 points. ABC's Michael Falcone reports that for the first time, Pennsylvania Democratic Senator Arlen Specter will campaign for Joe Sestak, the congressman who ended his hopes for a sixth term in the U.S. Senate by winning in the primary election. Senator Specter will appear with Mr. Sestak in Philadelphia on Monday. He'll also be appearing with Senator Bob Casey of Pennsylvania and New York Senator Democrat Chuck Schumer. And those are some of the latest headlines on C-SPAN Radio.